James Harris woke up early on a Monday morning, as he always did, long before the sun had fully risen. The alarm clock beeped, its monotonous sound dragging him from a fitful night's sleep. He rubbed his eyes and swung his legs off the side of the bed, the wooden floor cool under his feet. Another normal day. He went through the motions, brushing his teeth, showering, and pulling on the faded security uniform that had become as much a part of his identity as his own skin. He didn't mind the job. Being a security officer at the downtown office building allowed him a sense of purpose, and his boss, Mrs. Collins, was a no-nonsense woman who had always treated him with respect. It was predictable, quiet, and dependable, just the way James liked his life. As he stepped out the door, the crisp morning air hit his face, carrying the scent of freshly brewed coffee from the corner cafe. He walked to his car, a beat-up sedan that had seen better days, but it was reliable. He drove to work, the city streets mostly empty, save for the occasional early riser jogging or heading to their own routines. He passed familiar landmarks, each one a quiet reminder of how much of his life was tied to this neighborhood. He wasn't a big believer in change. He preferred the stability of his routine, the familiar faces, and the rhythm of the city that seemed to pulse slowly in sync with his own heartbeat. By the time James arrived at the office building, the sun had just begun to rise, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. He punched in his code and unlocked the building's glass doors, feeling the cool air from the air conditioning greet him as he stepped inside. The building was still mostly empty, the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft click of elevator buttons the only sounds. James walked through the lobby, waving to a few of the building's tenants who were already making their way to their offices. He smiled, nodding as he checked the security monitors and adjusted the settings on the security system. His job was simple enough: ensure the building was secure, monitor the surveillance cameras, and keep an eye out for any potential problems. It was easy work, and it allowed him time to reflect on his life. He'd worked here for over 3 years, and though the days often felt long and repetitive, he found comfort in their predictability. James was halfway through his first round when he noticed a few unusual things. First, a car pulled up outside the building, an unfamiliar, sleek black vehicle that didn't belong to any of the regular tenants. It was still early, so James wasn't sure who would be arriving at such an odd hour. He figured it was someone with a special appointment, so he made a note of it in his log. He continued his rounds, inspecting every floor, making sure everything was as it should be. It wasn't until he reached the upper level that things started to feel different. The air seemed heavier somehow, and he could hear a faint conversation happening behind one of the closed office doors. It wasn't unusual for people to work early, but this conversation was louder than usual, and the voices were unfamiliar. Curiosity piqued, James approached the door slowly, pressing his ear against it. The voices were sharp, angry even. He could hear a man arguing with someone inside, but the words were muffled and unclear. He stood there for a moment, unsure if he should knock or leave it alone, when suddenly the door swung open. Out stepped a man in a uniform, police officer's uniform, to be precise. The officer had a stern expression, his eyes narrowing as he glanced over at James. The man didn't seem to notice James right away, but when he did, his gaze hardened, and there was something about the way he looked at James that didn't sit right with him. "Everything all right here?" James asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. The officer, who looked to be in his early 30s, glanced at him with a look of mild annoyance, as if he'd been interrupted. "Just doing my rounds," the officer said curtly, not offering much else. "What's your name?" "James Harris," James replied, feeling a bit uneasy under the officer's intense stare. "I'm the security officer here. Is there something I can help you with?" The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his posture shifting to something more intimidating. "You're the security? You're sure this building's locked up tight? We've had reports of a break-in in the area." His voice was tinged with suspicion. James felt a knot form in his stomach. He had checked the building just hours earlier, and everything was secure. But the officer's tone was firm, and there was a trace of doubt in his eyes that made James question whether he was being believed. "Yes, sir. Everything's locked up tight," James said, trying to reassure him. The officer didn't seem convinced, his eyes scanning the area as though looking for something out of place. There was an awkward silence before he spoke again, this time with more authority. "I need to check the premises. You'll accompany me." James wasn't sure what to make of it. Normally, the police didn't come into the building unless there was an emergency. He had no problem with cooperating, but something about this officer's demeanor felt off. "Of course," James said, trying to hide his discomfort. He led the officer through the building, showing him the security cameras and walking him through the different floors. As they moved through the hallways, James could feel the officer's eyes on him, studying him in a way that felt unsettling. By the time they reached the basement level, James was starting to feel the weight of the officer's presence more acutely. The man seemed to be scrutinizing everything, every corner, every lock, even James himself. It wasn't just the job he was questioning, it was James as a person. And James couldn't shake the feeling that the officer's suspicions weren't entirely based on his duties, they felt personal. "All right, I think we're done here," the officer said, his tone still cold. "But I need you to stick around. Something doesn't sit right with me. I'll need to check you out before you leave." James felt a chill run down his spine. He opened his mouth to protest, but before he could say anything, the officer's voice cut through the air, firm and unyielding. "Don't argue with me." James' pulse quickened. The morning that had started out so normally, so predictably, had taken a sudden and strange turn. What had begun as a routine day now felt ominously like it was slipping out of his control, and he had no idea just how much worse things were about to get. James felt the tension in the air thickening with each passing second. The officer's commanding tone echoed in his ears as he nodded slowly, unsure of what to do next. He had worked in security long enough to know when things were escalating, but he couldn't figure out why this was happening now. His gut told him something wasn't right, but his professionalism kept him from reacting impulsively. The officer was in charge here, he was a law enforcement figure, after all. James kept his hands by his sides, trying to remain calm. As they continued through the building, the officer seemed more and more scrutinizing. He muttered under his breath, inspecting every room with a level of intensity that made James uneasy. It wasn't just the search itself, it was the way the officer's gaze kept darting back to him, almost as if he were looking for something to discredit him. James tried his best to keep his composure, but he couldn't help but feel the officer's suspicious eyes on him as they moved through the corridors. The walls felt suddenly narrow, and the air seemed to grow thicker with each step they took. They reached the lower levels of the building, where the storage areas were kept. It was always a quiet part of the building, seldom visited unless something important needed to be accessed. James unlocked the heavy metal door to the storage area, his fingers slightly trembling as he keyed in the code. The officer stepped in before him, sweeping his flashlight across the dark corners of the room, his shadow stretching unnaturally on the concrete walls. James followed closely behind, his steps deliberate but hesitant. He couldn't shake the growing sense of discomfort as the officer seemed to linger, inspecting every inch of the room. There was nothing in the storage area that seemed out of place, nothing that would warrant this level of attention. But the officer's unease was palpable. "You're sure this building's secure?" the officer asked again, his voice now carrying an edge of doubt, as if questioning James's authority. "Absolutely," James replied, keeping his tone steady despite the rising anxiety inside him. "I've been through here twice already today, checked every lock, every exit." The officer didn't seem satisfied. Instead, he kept circling the room, eyes darting from shelf to shelf, from corner to corner. Then, without warning, he turned and looked James up and down, as if seeing him for the first time. "You sure you're not hiding something?" he asked, his voice suddenly cold, accusatory. James' heart skipped a beat. The word struck him like a punch. He was used to suspicion. After all, he was a security officer in a building where people came and went at all hours, but the officer's tone felt different. It wasn't just professional concern, it felt personal. There was something more in his voice, a judgment he couldn't quite place. "I'm just doing my job," James said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know what you're implying, but I'm not hiding anything." The officer stepped closer, his body towering over James in the dimly lit room. "I'm not sure I believe you. I think you're hiding something from me." The officer's words were sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. James could feel the tension in the room grow even thicker, his instinct screaming at him to do something, to say something, to push back. But he was caught between the need to defuse the situation and the fear that any wrong move could make things worse. He had been in uncomfortable situations before, but this was something different. The officer's hostility wasn't making sense, and it was starting to feel like James was being painted as the enemy when he was only trying to do his job. "Look, I don't know what your problem is, but I'm not hiding anything," James repeated, his voice gaining strength despite the unease creeping up his spine. "I've worked here for 3 years. You can check anything you want, but there's nothing wrong." The officer paused, his gaze hardening even more. "I don't need your permission to check you out, Harris. You're not above suspicion." The officer's words were becoming more threatening, and James realized that what had started as a routine check was turning into something much more dangerous. "I've got work to do," James said, trying to step away, but the officer blocked his path. "I need to finish my rounds." "No, you're not going anywhere." The officer's voice had turned into a growl now, filled with anger and authority. "You're going to stay right here and wait for backup. I've had enough of this attitude." James' chest tightened. He felt trapped in the small storage room, the officer's imposing figure blocking the only exit. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the officer was making it clear that he didn't care about that. James wasn't sure what he was dealing with anymore. This wasn't a normal interaction, not by a long shot. Something was off. The officer's eyes were wide with suspicion, and there was a cruel edge to his words that made James' blood run cold. "You're making a mistake," James said, his voice now laced with frustration. He needed to get out of this situation, but he didn't know how. It felt like no matter what he said, the officer was determined to make him the target of whatever suspicion he was carrying. The officer didn't respond. Instead, he reached for his radio, speaking into it in clipped, authoritative tones. "I need backup. We've got a situation here." The words hit James like a sledgehammer. He had worked around police officers long enough to recognize when things were escalating. Backup? For what? A routine security check had now spiraled into something James couldn't control. His stomach twisted in knots as he realized that what had started as a minor confrontation was now spiraling out of control. It wasn't just about the building anymore, it was about him. The officer's voice crackled through the radio again, his words incomprehensible as he gave his location. James' pulse raced, his mind working frantically to figure out how he had ended up in this position. What had he done to provoke this officer? He hadn't resisted, hadn't done anything wrong. But now he was being treated like a criminal. Before he could react, the officer turned to him abruptly, his eyes filled with an unsettling certainty. "I'm locking you in the bathroom while we wait for backup," he said coldly. "You're not going anywhere." James' mouth went dry as the officer grabbed him by the arm and dragged him down the hallway toward the nearest restroom. His mind raced. What had just happened? How had it escalated so quickly? The officer's grip tightened around his arm as he pushed James into the small, sterile bathroom and locked the door behind him with a final, resounding click. The reality of the situation hit James all at once. He was locked in a bathroom, alone, and at the mercy of an officer who seemed intent on punishing him for reasons he couldn't understand. The humiliation, the confusion, the fear, it all combined into a suffocating wave that left him breathless. He had no idea what had just happened, but he knew one thing for sure: nothing in his life was ever going to be the same again. James sat in the cold, fluorescent-lit bathroom, the sterile silence almost deafening around him. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to process what had just transpired. The door had slammed shut with a harsh finality, and the sound of the officer's footsteps faded into the distance, leaving him alone in the small, cramped space. The walls, painted in a dull, lifeless shade of white, seemed to close in on him, amplifying the feeling of helplessness. His mind raced, replaying the events of the morning over and over again, trying to make sense of it all. What had gone wrong? How had a routine security check turned into this? He pressed his back against the cold tile wall and exhaled sharply, trying to steady his breath. The anger bubbled up from deep within him, mixing with the confusion. He wasn't just frustrated, he was scared. Scared that this was some kind of mistake, but also scared because he had no idea how to get out of it. He had always followed the rules, always tried to do the right thing, and now, here he was, locked in a bathroom like a criminal. James' thoughts spiraled in 1,000 directions. What did the officer think he was hiding? Why was he being treated like this? He hadn't done anything wrong. The bathroom door remained shut, and for a long moment, all he could hear was the sound of his own breathing, shallow and quick. His thoughts swirled like a storm, each one more pressing than the last. What if this wasn't a mistake? What if the officer knew something he didn't, something that he was about to uncover? The idea seemed far-fetched, but the doubt gnawed at him. James had always prided himself on his sense of security and order, but now, with no way out and no answers, all of that seemed useless. He thought about his family, his wife, Lena, and their 2 kids, Ava and Jamal. They were counting on him. He was the provider, the steady hand in their lives, and now they were going to find out that he had been locked in a bathroom at work, suspected of something he didn't even understand. The shame was unbearable. How would he explain this to them? What would they think when they heard the truth? The sense of helplessness deepened. He could already imagine Lena's worried face, the questions she'd ask, the disappointment in her eyes. James tried to stand up, but the confined space made it difficult. His legs felt stiff, and the anxiety from being locked away like this was beginning to make him feel faint. He grabbed the sink to steady himself, looking at his reflection in the mirror. His dark brown eyes stared back at him, wide with uncertainty, but he barely recognized the man looking at him. This wasn't who he was. He wasn't someone who found himself in situations like this. He wasn't someone who got accused of things he didn't do. And yet, here he was, forced to question everything. The sound of a radio crackled from the hallway outside, and James flinched. He leaned closer to the door, hoping to hear anything that would explain what was happening, but it was muffled and indistinct. Another few moments passed, then another voice, this time, deeper, more authoritative. The conversation was low enough that James couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like the officer was talking to someone else. A few minutes later, the hallway fell silent again. James' mind was racing. He didn't know if he was being left here as some kind of punishment or if it was just a precaution, but the uncertainty was making his head spin. Was the officer still suspicious of him? Was this really about security, or was it something more? He couldn't help but feel that the officer's behavior wasn't just about the building's security, it felt personal. Maybe he had said something to provoke the officer, or maybe the officer had something against him from the start. The officer had looked at him in a way that felt off, a look of distrust that wasn't just about his job, but something more sinister. Minutes turned into hours, or at least it felt that way. Time had become a blur as he sat there, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling of helplessness that had settled in his stomach. The weight was unbearable. He thought back to the strange look the officer had given him when they first met. Something was off about that moment, like the officer was seeing him as more than just a security guard. But why? Was it because of his race? James couldn't help but wonder if there was an underlying racial bias that had triggered this situation. He wasn't naive, he knew that people of color, especially black men, sometimes faced discrimination that went unnoticed by others. But this? This felt like more than just prejudice. It felt deliberate. And that was what made it all the more terrifying. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway again, and James' heart jumped. Was the officer returning? Or was it someone else coming to finish what he had started? He pressed his ear against the door, straining to hear the sound of the approaching footsteps. They stopped right outside, and then the door to the bathroom was rattled. James jumped back, his pulse racing as the handle turned. The door swung open, revealing the officer again, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. But this time, he wasn't alone. Another man, taller and broader, stepped into the room behind him. His uniform was different, he was wearing a tactical vest, and his expression was one of grim authority. "Mr. Harris," the officer said, his tone sharp, almost accusatory. "I'm Officer Stevens. This is Officer Williams. We're here to take you into custody." James' stomach dropped. Custody? He stared at the two officers in disbelief. "What?" he managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. "I haven't done anything wrong. Why are you doing this?" "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Officer Stevens replied, his tone colder than before. "You've been acting suspicious, and we have every reason to believe you're involved in something illegal." James took a step back, his heart pounding faster now. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. He had been security for 3 years, he had done nothing wrong. Nothing at all. Yet, here he was, accused of something he couldn't understand, locked in a bathroom, facing the very people who were supposed to protect him. Officer Stevens stepped forward, his face hardening. "You'll be coming with us, Harris. We need to sort this out." Wait. "I don't understand," James said, his voice rising in panic. "What are you talking about? I don't know what you think I've done, but this is all a mistake. Please, I didn't." But Officer Stevens was already moving, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him out of the bathroom, his grip firm and unyielding. The world around James seemed to tilt, and for a moment, everything went black. The last thing he heard before being dragged down the hallway was the sound of his own breath, shallow and ragged, and the awful, sinking feeling that his life had just been turned upside down. James was barely aware of his surroundings as Officer Stevens led him down the hallway. His mind was in a daze, his body on autopilot, moving with little more than the mechanical instinct to follow. He couldn't comprehend what was happening to him. The officer's grip on his arm was tight, unyielding, as though he were some kind of threat, something dangerous to be controlled. James hadn't done anything. He had been at work, doing his job, when everything shifted, spiraling into a nightmare. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching in front of him like a tunnel that closed in on him with each step. They passed the security desk, and James' eyes instinctively darted toward it, hoping for any sign of help. But the desk was empty. No one was there to witness what was happening, no one to ask questions, to challenge what seemed like an absurd, unjust situation. He couldn't even look back, the officers were too close, the grip on his arm too firm. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered in a harsh rhythm, casting an unflattering glow that felt almost oppressive. He could hear the distant hum of the building's air conditioning system, a cold, mechanical sound that matched the chill settling in his bones. The world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the feeling of isolation and confusion that gripped him. Officer Stevens guided him through the building as though James were a criminal, as though he were a suspect in something far more serious than a mere misunderstanding. The building, which had once felt like a place of routine security and control, now felt alien, hostile. Every corner he turned, every door that creaked open, seemed to hold a hidden threat, something waiting to trap him further in a web of uncertainty. They finally reached the exit door, where a black SUV was parked outside, its engine running in the cold morning air. 2 more officers stood by the vehicle, their faces obscured by dark sunglasses, their postures rigid with purpose. James' stomach twisted as he was pushed toward the vehicle, and a sense of dread settled deeper in his chest. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. Why was this happening to him? Before he could protest, Officer Stevens shoved him roughly into the back seat of the SUV. He hit the leather seat with a thud, his breath caught in his throat as the officer slammed the door shut. Through the tinted windows, James saw the building recede, disappearing into the distance as the vehicle sped off. The landscape outside blurred as they drove further away from the place that had once felt like a safe haven, further away from everything that had made sense. The silence inside the car was suffocating. James sat in the back, his wrists still aching from where the officer had gripped him too tightly, his mind spinning with 1,000 questions. What did they think he had done? Why was he being taken to God knows where? His phone had been left behind, still sitting on the desk where he had placed it that morning. His colleagues, if they even knew what was going on, were powerless to help him. This was beyond anything he could have imagined. The events of the last hour felt like a dream, a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. The car pulled into a dimly lit parking garage, and James' heart skipped a beat. It was an unmarked building, the kind of place that didn't feel like it belonged to the world he knew. The walls were gray and cracked, the lighting low and flickering. He was barely aware of the officers guiding him out of the car until he was standing in front of a metal door that seemed to loom over him like a prison gate. "Come on," Officer Stevens ordered, pushing him forward. James stumbled slightly, his legs unsteady from the adrenaline and fear coursing through him. He was too stunned to speak, too confused to even form a coherent thought. He was led through the door into a small, stark room with nothing but a table, a couple of chairs, and a glaring light overhead that seemed designed to make him feel exposed, vulnerable. This wasn't just a police interrogation room. This felt like something far darker, something he couldn't begin to understand. One of the officers, Officer Williams, he assumed, motioned for James to sit down. His hand was still gripping James' arm with a firm, almost aggressive hold. James lowered himself into the chair, his mind still racing. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew it was only getting worse. The officers sat across from him, their expressions unreadable, as if they were deciding something, weighing their options before they spoke. The air in the room was thick with tension, the silence suffocating. "We're going to be very clear with you, Mr. Harris," Officer Stevens said finally, his voice low and controlled, but with an unmistakable edge. "You are not free to leave until we get some answers. We've been monitoring you for some time now, and your involvement in this situation is troubling." James' mind froze. He couldn't even process the words at first. He had been monitored? What was he even being accused of? This was insane. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice shaky but defiant. "I'm just a security guard. I've done nothing wrong." Stevens leaned forward, his hands folded in front of him on the table. "It's not just about what you've done, Mr. Harris. It's about what you're hiding. We know you've been in contact with certain individuals, people who are linked to an ongoing investigation. You've been under surveillance for weeks. We have evidence." His words were cold, calculated, and they hit James with the force of a brick. James blinked, his mind struggling to catch up with the accusations. Surveillance? Evidence? His mind reeled as he tried to make sense of it. He had never been involved in anything illegal. He didn't know any criminals. He didn't have ties to anyone involved in anything shady. The entire idea felt alien to him, like a plot in a crime movie he'd seen on TV. He felt trapped, caught in a lie that wasn't his. "I don't know what you're talking about," James repeated, his voice gaining strength. "You've got it all wrong. I'm not hiding anything. I'm just a security guard, just a guy trying to make a living. Officer Stevens didn't blink. Save it. We have everything we need. It's only a matter of time before the truth comes out. A cold shiver ran down James' spine. He wasn't just being questioned. He was being accused, and whatever this was, it wasn't about his job anymore. He was involved in something far bigger than he could comprehend, and whatever it was coming for him. The truth he had once relied on to guide him, to keep him safe, was slipping through his fingers. Nothing was making sense, and every minute he spent in this room seemed to push him further into a nightmare he couldn't escape from. The door opened, and another officer stepped in, his face stern. James couldn't believe it when he saw the officer's badge, Detective Daniels. This wasn't a routine questioning anymore. This was a full-blown investigation, and he was at the center of it. "Mr. Harris," Daniels said, his voice low, "you need to cooperate if you want to get out of here. The more you resist, the worse this is going to get." James could feel the walls closing in around him. His mind was screaming, but his body couldn't react. It was like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, with nothing beneath him but uncertainty and fear. Whatever had just happened to him, whatever had spun out of control, was only just beginning. The weight of Detective Daniels' words hung heavily in the air, sinking deep into James' chest. The cold, sterile room seemed to grow smaller, suffocating him as he tried to process the magnitude of what was unfolding. This was no longer just a misunderstanding. This was no longer just about being accused of something he hadn't done. The detectives, the officers, they weren't just questioning him anymore. They were building a case, and James was at the heart of it, trapped in a nightmare that made no sense. The room's bright, harsh lights felt like they were closing in on him, each passing second adding to the pressure that seemed to press against his skull. He couldn't even look at Detective Daniels. The man's steely gaze was unwavering, and every word he spoke carried the weight of authority, of someone who had already decided James was guilty. "We've been watching you for weeks, Mr. Harris," Daniels continued, his voice smooth, controlled, almost rehearsed. "And we have everything we need. It's just a matter of time before we prove it." James could feel the panic rising in his throat, his heart hammering in his chest. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to ask why this was happening. But every time he opened his mouth, the words seemed to freeze before they could escape. How had his life turned into this? He was a man of routine, of stability. He went to work every day, took care of his family, and tried his best to be a good man. And yet, here he was, locked in a room with two detectives who believed he was a criminal. "I'm not hiding anything," James said, his voice growing desperate. "I've never been involved in any criminal activity. I don't know what you're talking about. You have to believe me." Detective Daniels didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as though he were studying James, trying to read him, to gauge his sincerity. The silence stretched on, making James feel more exposed than ever. It felt like an eternity, each passing moment an agonizing reminder that he had no control over what was happening to him. The clock on the wall ticked away, its sound echoing in the tense quiet. Finally, Daniels spoke again, his tone shifting. "We know you've been in contact with certain individuals who have connections to a larger operation. You don't need to pretend you don't understand, Mr. Harris. We've tracked your communications. We've seen your movements." The words were like a slap across his face. James blinked in disbelief. "What are you talking about? I don't even know these people you're talking about. I'm just a security guard, just a regular guy doing my job." His voice was frantic now, the reality of what was happening crashing down around him. He was being accused of something he couldn't even comprehend. Something huge, something terrifying. How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? Detective Daniels remained impassive. "We've got evidence." Your phone records, the surveillance footage from the building, the messages you've been sending. It all adds up. And it all points to one thing. You're involved. The room seemed to spin, and for a moment, James thought he might lose control. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, the walls closing in as the pressure mounted. He could feel the weight of their accusations crushing him, each word pulling him further into a nightmare that felt more like a twisted reality than something he could escape from. I swear, I don't know what you're talking about, he shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. I don't even know these people. I didn't do anything wrong. Daniels leaned forward, locking eyes with him. It's no use, Mr. Harris. We have everything. It's time to stop denying it. You're caught up in something much bigger than you realize. James' mind was racing. His heart was pounding so loudly in his ears that it almost drowned out the detective's voice. Everything Daniels was saying felt like a blur, an incoherent jumble of words that didn't fit together. Nothing made sense. He wasn't involved in anything criminal. He hadn't done anything wrong. This was all some terrible mistake, some colossal misunderstanding, and yet it felt like the walls were closing in faster than he could explain himself. The door to the interrogation room creaked open, and another officer stepped in. James' eyes darted to the doorway, his body tensing as the newcomer entered. It was Officer Stevens, the same officer who had arrested him, the one who had dragged him from the bathroom and thrown him into this nightmare. He was followed by another man, tall and thin, wearing a suit that looked more like a corporate uniform than a police officer's outfit. The man's face was stern, his eyes calculating as he glanced at James before turning to Daniels. Daniels stood up, exchanging a brief but meaningful look with the new arrival. James couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something bigger, something that was now out of his hands. Mr. Harris, Daniels said, his voice now devoid of any pretense of sympathy. This is Mr. Palmer, our lead investigator. He's the one who's been overseeing the case. He'll be taking over from here. Mr. Palmer gave James a cold, impassive glance before turning his attention back to Daniels. James was stunned. He had never heard of this lead investigator. What kind of operation was this? What kind of case was he supposedly caught up in? His mind was swimming with confusion and fear, and every passing second seemed to drag him deeper into the abyss of uncertainty. I've reviewed the evidence, Mr. Palmer said in a measured tone, his eyes briefly flicking toward James. And I believe it's time we get some answers. James' stomach turned. What kind of answers could they possibly be looking for? His mind was reeling, trying to piece together any semblance of what had happened, but it felt like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. Everything was slipping away from him, like sand through his fingers. I haven't done anything, James said, his voice a strained whisper. I'm not guilty of anything. You have to believe me. Mr. Palmer didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a step closer to the table, his sharp gaze never leaving James. We know that you've been involved with people who have connections to illegal activities. This isn't just about you, Mr. Harris. This is about a network. And you're at the center of it. James felt the blood drain from his face. A network? What was Palmer talking about? He had no connections to anything illegal, no connections to anyone who could be part of any network. His mind struggled to find any clue, any shred of evidence that could explain this insanity. I'm not a part of any network. James shouted, the desperation clear in his voice. I'm just a security guard, doing my job. Please, you have to believe me. Mr. Palmer remained silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if weighing James' words. Then he spoke, his voice calm and deliberate. You'll have your chance to explain yourself, Mr. Harris. But for now, we have what we need. And soon, you'll understand how deep this goes. The finality in his voice struck James like a punch to the gut. He felt the walls closing in again, suffocating him as the weight of the situation became too much to bear. He wasn't just in trouble. He wasn't just caught in a misunderstanding. He was entangled in something far darker and more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. The room seemed to tilt around him, and his mind raced as he realized just how much he was at the mercy of the very people who were supposed to protect him. James wasn't just fighting for his freedom now. He was fighting for his life. James had no idea how much time had passed since Palmer's chilling words echoed in his ears. Hours? Minutes? It was hard to keep track of time in this suffocating room, under the weight of their accusations. His thoughts were a chaotic blur, each passing moment deepening the sense of dread that had taken root in his chest. The detectives continued to watch him, their silence heavy and oppressive, as though they were waiting for him to break, for him to say something that would justify their suspicions. But James had nothing to offer. Nothing to say that would change the nightmare he had been thrust into. He was just an ordinary man, a security guard, someone trying to make a living. How had it all come to this? As the minutes dragged on, the feeling of isolation grew. His mind raced, but no answers came. He thought back to that morning, his routine, his calm, normal day at work. How had a simple shift turned into this? He could still feel the cold metal of the cuffs around his wrists, the tight grip of the officers, the suffocating weight of their presence. Nothing about this felt real. Nothing about this felt like something he could fight. What had he done to deserve this? What could he possibly have done to land himself at the center of something this twisted? The door to the interrogation room opened again, and James jumped slightly, his nerves frayed, his heart still pounding in his chest. A different officer stepped in, a woman this time. She was tall, with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through the dim lighting of the room. She had an air of authority about her, but there was something in her expression, something almost sympathetic, as if she didn't fully believe what was happening. For a moment, James thought he saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Mr. Harris," she began, her voice cool but not unkind. "I'm Detective Simmons. I understand this situation is confusing, but we need you to understand that this is bigger than you." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I'm going to be straightforward with you. We have evidence that connects you to a series of high-profile criminal activities. We have your name, your face, your fingerprints on certain documents, and your phone records from the last several weeks." James' head spun. "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know these people. I don't have anything to do with any of this." His voice cracked, the strain of the situation threatening to overtake him. "You've got the wrong guy." Detective Simmons leaned in slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "I know you're scared. But you need to understand that the more you deny it, the worse this is going to get. You're tangled up in something much bigger than you realize. We've been watching you for weeks now, and we have everything: footage, communications, evidence. This isn't a mistake. We've been tracking the network you're involved in. And whether you knew it or not, you've been a part of it." Each word that came from her mouth felt like a slap to the face, each sentence more unbelievable than the last. James wanted to shout, to scream at the injustice of it all, but he couldn't. His mind couldn't process the accusations fast enough to formulate a defense. His hands were trembling, his chest tight, his heart thundering against his ribs. It was all happening so fast, like a train derailing in slow motion, and he couldn't stop it. "I don't have anything to do with whatever this is," he repeated, his voice shaking now. "I'm just a guard at a building, I'm just trying to do my job. You're accusing the wrong person." His voice was almost pleading at this point, desperate for someone, anyone, to believe him. Detective Simmons gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I believe you're telling the truth, Mr. Harris," she said, her tone softening just a fraction. "But sometimes, the truth isn't enough. You've been in contact with individuals who are part of a larger criminal enterprise. And until you can prove otherwise, you're tied to it. Whether you want to be or not. James' mind reeled. He thought back to the past few weeks, to his life, his simple, ordinary life, and he couldn't think of anything, anyone, who could possibly connect him to such dark dealings. His phone was clean, his social media accounts, everything, there was no evidence, no trace of anything illegal. He was just a man doing his job. How could they possibly have tracked him? How could they possibly have mistaken him for a criminal mastermind? But the longer he sat there, the more his mind began to crack. What if they were right? What if, by some twist of fate, he had unknowingly crossed paths with people who were involved in something much larger than he could ever have imagined? The idea seemed impossible, but then again, the reality of what was happening to him now seemed impossible, too. How do you explain this, Mr. Harris? Detective Simmons pressed, her eyes narrowing. How do you explain your connection to the illegal arms deals, the money laundering, the coordinated operations we've been tracking? Your name keeps coming up. You're tied to it, whether you know it or not. James sat back in his chair, a sinking feeling in his stomach. I don't know, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I don't know how any of this could be true. I haven't done anything wrong. Simmons sighed deeply, the weight of the situation settling over her like a heavy fog. She was silent for a long moment, staring at James with a mixture of frustration and empathy, but her next words were unwavering. I'm going to give you one chance to be honest with us, Mr. Harris. The longer you withhold the truth, the worse it's going to get for you. You're a small part of a much larger operation, and we're going to expose it. If you're really innocent, you need to help us. If you don't, we'll have no choice but to proceed with our case. You're in a very dangerous position, and you need to make a decision. James felt a cold shiver run through him. His head was spinning. He didn't know what to do, what to say. It felt like he was drowning in a sea of lies, of accusations that didn't belong to him. He wanted to scream out that he was innocent, that this was all a mistake, but it felt like no one would listen. He was trapped. His mind raced with every possibility, every scenario. He couldn't think clearly. His every instinct screamed for him to deny everything, but something inside him told him that maybe, just maybe, the answers didn't lie in his words. What was he supposed to do? How was he supposed to prove his innocence when everything around him seemed designed to make him guilty? He had no one on his side, no allies, no answers. The weight of the situation was unbearable, and for the first time, he didn't know if he could fight his way out.